In 1747, Benjamin Franklin organized what was known as the Philadelphia Associators. It was really a volunteer militia organized for the protection of the city. Well, in 1776, Colonel John Cadwallader became its senior officer in charge of the 3rd Battalion. And in December of that year, he and his volunteer militia were stationed 10 miles south of Trenton, New Jersey. They were on the west side of the Delaware River, at the ferry between Bristol, Pennsylvania, and Burlington, New Jersey. Colonel Cadwallader was under orders to send his men across the river on Christmas Day. They were to approach Trenton from the south. In the meantime, General Washington and his men would advance on Trenton from the north. Well, the colonel was able to cross some of his troops, but he was unable to advance his artillery. You see, there was ice in the river, and the ice was too thick to use boats, but too thin to cross on foot. Very frustrated, the colonel returned his men to camp in Pennsylvania, and he instructed them to get on their knees and to be praying for their commander-in-chief and his unsupported army in New Jersey. Now, we know, of course, that Washington surprised and defeated the Hessian garrison with minimal casualties. So the question is, did Washington win the conflict merely on the basis of stealth? Or maybe it was good luck, or perhaps it was superior military strategy. Not taking anything away from General Washington, but it could have also been the fact that there was a group of soldiers who were on their knees praying for their comrades before this even began. You see, when people go to God first, then confront their enemies, great victories are possible. We see that in our text for today. We're in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, looking at verses 2 through 15. It's the story of King Asa and a battle that he faces and the fact that he chooses to go to God first and foremost. Now in verse 2, we're reminded that when Asa took the throne of Judah after his father Abijah had died, he determined to do what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. And during his 41-year reign from 910 to 869 BC, he sought to restore the ways of David. Now that meant honoring God while building the kingdom. You see, times of peace were used for strengthening and for reformation. In verse 3, we see that during this time of peace, Asa worked hard to institute major reforms. He cleansed the kingdom of idolatry by removing elements of false worship that had accumulated over the years of Solomon, Rehoboam, and his father Abijah. In verse 4, we see that Asa was a man after God's own heart, much like David, because he commanded Judah to seek the Lord and to obey his word, all of his commandments and instructions. It wasn't about being the king, it was about honoring the Lord. Asa put God first, and that always pays off. In verse 5, the scripture tells us that he removed the high places. Now, there's a parallel account of this in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 14, but that tells us that he did not remove the high places. Now, this is not a contradiction in Scripture. It's a difference in chronology. You see, at the beginning of his reign, Asa did remove the high places, but then they gradually seem to have reemerged in Judah over the span of his reign. His son Jehoshaphat later had to remove them, although he too did not remove them all completely. It was a constant struggle for the nation. In verses 6 through 8, he constructed fortified cities to protect the people from future enemies. Now, in this context, we find the word rest, and that the Lord granted them rest, and they were in a time of rest. But that did not mean rest from labor or rest from doing what the Lord had instructed or what the Lord wanted. It meant rest in the sense of peace. You see, again, during those times of peace, we're not just to be lying around doing nothing. There's always work to be done to honor our God. Asa, we are told, has an army of 580,000 fighting men of valor. That's a bit more than what his father Abijah had. He had about 400,000. So we can see that the Lord is already blessing his efforts, and he's also preparing them for what lies ahead. God does that for you and me as well. He knows what's going to happen. He knows what already has happened, and he's always with us, preparing us for what is next, teaching us to trust him even more. It was true for King Asa, and it's true for us as well. We find that problem, if you will, or that next hurdle in verses 9 through 10. A major threat developed from Zerah the Ethiopian. Now, this was probably on behalf of the Egyptian Pharaoh. He was attempting to regain control, much like Shishak had during the reign of Rehoboam in 901 to 900 BC. Now, Mareshah was about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, and Rehoboam had earlier reinforced this city. So this is where they decide to meet, to kind of have it out, if you will. And so they line up their troops, and they're prepared for battle. But before they engage, before Asa is willing to face his enemy, he faces God. He goes to the Lord in prayer, in earnest, sincere prayer, seeking God's will, seeking God's help, and wanting to be obedient to whatever the Lord commands. We find that in verses 11 through 12, that despite the overwhelming size and power of this enemy, Asa was confident in the power of the Lord his God. His appeal to God centered on the Lord's omnipotence and his reputation, and his desire to take care of his people who were seeking to honor him. Now, for much of Israel's history, the Ethiopians were regarded as powerful warriors, so any defeat of Ethiopia would demonstrate again the faithfulness and the power of our God. Well, as we find in verses 13 through 15, the Lord not only defended Judah, but he also helped Asa to conquer all the cities around Gerar. Now, that was located very close to the Egyptian border. Now, Egypt does not appear on the scene for another 150 years. So by trusting in the Lord, they not only secured the victory for them, but also for future generations, at least for 150 years longer. Now, it also appears that this group of Ethiopians, this huge nomadic people, they went everywhere with their possessions. And so when they were conquered, the spoils of Judah's victory were immense. Now, what that means to us is the fact that God once again proves that when we trust him, when we go to him in sincere prayer, seeking his will and putting him first, even before we face our enemies, even though we might have reason to be discouraged, when we trust in God, he not only secures the victory for us, but he overwhelms us with his abundance of grace and mercy. Judah was overwhelmed by the spoils that they collected as a result of the Lord's favor. Well, going back to General Washington, he had suffered major defeats at Brandywine Creek in Germantown. He finds himself facing one of the worst winters in all of history. He has about 12,000 troops left to fight the entire British army, and winter is howling down his neck. In fact, during this particular winter, Washington would lose almost a third of his army, just to the cold, to the conditions. He goes into a desolate, barren valley in Pennsylvania to spend the winter to try to recuperate from the stinging defeats the enemy has given him. There's no real shelter for his men at Valley Forge. His army is practically naked and starving, and old man discouragement is coming to sow his seeds of defeat. It looks as though this fledgling new nation of the United States of America will be annihilated both by the bitter winter and by the British Army. Washington is at his wit's end. He doesn't know what to do next, so, like many of us, after we've tried all that we can think of, then he prays. I wonder, if we would pray first, we might be able to avoid some of that discouragement. But Washington prays. He prays for guidance, for direction. He prays for victory, and he prays for peace. He then instructs Baron von Steuben to train and shape the army he has left into a fighting force. He encourages them to get up and to go on. Unfortunately, they failed to secure victories at White Marsh and Monmouth. They weren't really defeats, but they weren't really victories. And so the people are still pretty discouraged. They're wondering, what are we doing wrong? Again, Washington prays. Then he goes to Yorktown, and we all know the rest of the story. You see, after every discouragement, there is a victory if you put God first. It was true for our nation's first president. It was true for King Asa, and it's true for us today. Before we try to confront any enemy we may face, despite any discouragement we may have experienced, we must go to our God in prayer, seeking his will and his timing, his purpose in and through us. Then and only then will the victory be ours. We can have victory if we will put God first in all of our lives and before we face any enemies we may have. Discouragement is just leading to prayer if we will allow the Lord to be first in our lives.